take part in the MLK program, and I'm just really excited to speak to you guys in Washington State. So I'm going to present a PowerPoint presentation, and it's meant to be interactive. And so I would love it if you guys would, feel comfortable to participate by either including comments when prompted or asking questions if there's, anything that I say that you have questions about. And if the feeling strikes you and you want to, raise your hand and ask your question that way or participate that way, that's totally fine as well. But I'm looking forward to engaging with you guys and hopefully learning something from you about your perspective and your experiences as I share my presentation. Someone has a question already? Okay, looks like
Uh,
someone answered it.
Yes,
Okay,
and when we do get to the questions, please put them in the Q&A section or in the chat. Thank you.
okay, great. So I'm going to get started. The screen share. Okay. So, as Iman said, my name is Michelle Coles, and I am a civil rights attorney. I worked at the U.S. Department of Justice in the Civil Rights Division for 12 years. I began in a unit that investigates police misconduct, the civil side of police misconduct, not the criminal prosecution side, but we were looking at identifying what institutional issues were leading to violations, the police violating people's civil rights. So whether it was a lack of training or a lack of accountability or any number of things. And so I did that. I also did investigations of the criminal justice system, in particular places where people were incarcerated, like jails and prisons and juvenile prisons. And again, we were looking at whether people were violating people's civil rights within the institution on the civil side, not doing criminal prosecutions. But I learned a lot and I saw a lot through those experiences. And a lot of those experiences I pulled into my work as an author. And so, as an author, I wrote a novel, a young adult novel about the Reconstruction era. And it's the first young adult historical fiction about the Reconstruction era. And so, in my presentation, we're going to talk more about what is the Reconstruction era, why is it significant, and why don't we know more about it given its significance. And I'm also a public speaker. And so I love doing these presentations and meeting young people around the country, talking at colleges and corporations and K through 12 schools. And so I love the audience engagement. So hopefully we'll have a great time tonight and learn something new. So the topic of my presentation is past is prologue. And what does that mean? It's an expression that means essentially that people that don't know their past are doomed to repeat it. It has that same meaning, right? It's that if we study the past, we can understand our present better, and it can also give us insight into the future. And so if we want to make changes about our present reality, and if we also want to make those changes have an impact to alter the future, then it's so essential and so important that we understand our past and where we've come from. And, with this being a Martin Luther King program, of course, I wanted to highlight one of his quotes. And so one of his quotes is, "No society can fully repress an ugly past when the ravages persist into the present. America owes a debt of justice, which it has only begun to pay." And this is a quote from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s book, Where Do We Go From Here?, which he published in 1967, the year before his assassination. This is an interactive slide, so hopefully some people will make comments in the chat box. America the Beautiful. There are so many wonderful things about our country, about America. And I'd like to ask you to think about and hopefully respond in the chat. What are your favorite things about living in America? What makes you proud to be an American? And if we get some answers, we can call those out. And if not, I'll share with you guys some of the answers that I think of what makes our country unique in the world, especially at the time of its founding. People talk about American exceptionalism. What is it what are the characteristics of that exceptionalism? What is it about America that really makes it a great place to live? So do we have any participation there?
No one's written in chat yet. Everyone, you're
Okay.
welcome to write in chat.
Okay. Even though I'm going to get started with some of my answers, feel free, just anything you think of. And I'll tell you, because I am a lawyer, a lot of my answers they fall more on like the legal side, but there are really no right or wrong answers here. It's just what comes to mind to you when you're thinking about what's great about being living in America. So something that I think of is that we have consent of the governed here, right? We have a democracy, we have a republic, we have a democratic republic. Essentially, what that means is the elected officials who run our country do so with the consent of the population. And that was such a novel concept at the time America was founded in 1776. Every other country at that time, for the most part, still had a king and a queen. And, France a couple years later overthrew their king and queen, and they went through their revolution, but that was after America's founding. But America was really the first in this period of time, in the modern era, where you saw a country being founded on an ideal of consent of the governed. So another great thing about being in America is that we have what's called due process of law. And so what due process of law means is that no police officer or whoever, no law enforcement officer can just pick you up and throw you in a prison cell and wipe his hands clean, right? Like, you are entitled to know what the charges are against you. You're entitled to an attorney, and if one, everything that they say in the Miranda rights, if you can't afford one will be appointed. You are entitled to confront your witnesses and confront the evidence against you. You're entitled to know if there was any exculpatory evidence, which means evidence that is in your favor, that does not support the charges that you're being accused of. So all of these things are examples of what due process of law are. And I'm sure right now you guys can think of other countries in the world today that do not have this principle embedded in their system of government, right? You could just be accused of something and then thrown in a cell and maybe never be heard from again, right? That exists in places, but thankfully not. It's not supposed to exist here. We have freedom of religion, right? And there are countries all around the world where you do not have freedom of religion, where maybe there's a state religion or what have you, but you can't practice your faith or practice no faith if that's what you choose to do. And please, if we get any answers in the chat box, feel free to jump in and cut me off, and then I'll continue. We've got freedom of speech, right? And so that's also really incredible. Like, we can espouse our views. We can criticize the government. We can write, plays that may be critical of politicians. We can do all types of things because we have freedom of speech. And again, there are a lot of countries in the past and in the present where that just doesn't exist. We have equal justice under the law. And when I say these are all the ideals of what we espouse to have. I'm not saying that we practice them perfectly in every instance, but we intend to have equal justice under the law, right? And so what that means is that every citizen is supposed to be treated equally. There are not supposed to be different standards for presidents and for people working at McDonald's. Like, everybody is supposed to be subject to the same laws and face the same system of justice. No taxation without representation. This is similar to consent of the government, but it's the trade-off we make, right? It's like, okay, we pay taxes, but we get to elect our representatives that choose how our taxes are being spent. And I, have to put an asterisk on that one because that's actually the tagline for the Washington, D.C. license plate is no taxation without representation, because they do not have voting representatives in Congress, as neither do the U.S. territories like Puerto Rico and Guam. No man is above the law, similar concept, equal justice under the law, right to protest the government for a redress of grievances, such an important right to have as a citizen. And I think something that really defines us as Americans, that we can protest our government, we can criticize our government, everything. And that, is a part of our First Amendment rights. We live in a diverse country. And I think that's also, really cool. We've got people from different places, lots of different, every language, almost every language in the world is probably spoken in some corner of America. We have access to, different types of food and cultures and religions and really there's something for everyone somewhere in this country. We have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and all men are created equal. Did we get any answers before I move on?
We did get a few.
Great.
So sorry that the chat is disabled, everyone. Please just use the Q&A section for now, at least. But some of the answers we got were education, the ability to protest and speak up about injustice, and diverse cultures. So a lot of things that you touched on, Michelle, and that's really
Awesome. And I have to confess, I've actually added to my slide almost every time I've done the presentation because someone has said something, and I'm like, you're right. Absolutely amazing. I got to add it in. So next time I present, some of your answers might end up on this slide. So all of these things are true, right? All of these things are true about our country, and they're all embedded in our founding documents of what is America and what is America supposed to be. However, there's a caveat. Not a single one of these great things applied to African Americans at the time of our country's founding. Okay, not a single one of them, because African Americans were not considered citizens, and by and large, the vast majority of people of African descent that were in the United States at the time of the country's founding, all the way up until the Civil War, were enslaved. However, that changed at the end of the Civil War when we entered a period in our country's history known as the Reconstruction era. And so after the Civil War, a series of constitutional amendments were passed. And these are called the Reconstruction Amendments, okay? And so there were 3 of them. If anyone knows what the Reconstruction Amendments, if anyone can name any of the Reconstruction Amendments, go ahead and throw it into the chat. Does anyone know what they are? By number, right? All the constitutional members are numbered. So the first 10 amendments to the Constitution are what we refer to as the Bill of Rights. And so that's when people say, oh, it's my First Amendment right to have freedom of speech or freedom of religion or protest the government. My Second Amendment right, people shorthand that to the right to bear arms. So the first 10 constitutional amendments are the Bill of Rights. But then we get to the Reconstruction era, and did we get an answer?
We just did. We got 13th, 14th, and 15th amendments.
Yes, exactly. So we have the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th Amendment to the United States Constitution, which dramatically changed the fabric of the United States, because what it did is it took all of those awesome things that we just talked about on the last slide, and it said they're going to apply to everyone. Okay, it changed what it meant to be an American. It defined what it meant to be American, and it made broad application of the best things of what being an American entails. And so we've got the 13th Amendment. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery and involuntary servitude, except for those duly convicted of a crime. And that exception ends up being really important later because it's an exception where there was a way to still enslave people, and that was through convicting them of crimes. And so, one of the things that you'll see shortly after the passage of the Reconstruction, of these Reconstruction amendments, was that several states passed things called black codes, right? And this is before the Jim Crow era, where you also had an overcriminalization of all types of conduct that was really intended to funnel African Americans into the criminal justice system and the penal system, because that was a way where they could technically be re-enslaved. Nevertheless, the 13th Amendment was still incredibly important because at the time that it was passed, it abolished slavery, which meant the emancipation, the official emancipation of 4.4 million African Americans. That's how many Black people in this country were enslaved at the end of the Civil War and at the time of the passage of the Reconstruction Amendments. And so the vast majority of those African Americans were in the South, in the states that made up the Confederacy. And for most of those Southern states, close to, if not half, of their entire population was African American. Okay, so it was 4.4 million enslaved people that were emancipated. And for nearly every state in the South, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, South Carolina, like all of those states, virtually half of their state population were enslaved people. And so if you think about that, what does that mean for the state of their democracy when half of the people in their state couldn't vote and didn't have representation, and we're not citizens? And so that takes us to the 14th Amendment. It granted US citizenship as a right to people born or naturalized in the United States. So that's the first time that existed. And what that did is it repudiated, if you guys are familiar with the Dred Scott versus Sanford decision issued by the Supreme Court like 15 years prior to when these constitutional amendments are being passed. The Supreme Court said in the Dred Scott case that Black people could not be citizens of the United States, and in fact had no rights that a white person had to respect. And this 14th Amendment invalidated that Supreme Court ruling and said, no, actually, any person born in the United States or naturalized, right? And so that's also very important for the immigrant population. You are a citizen. And not only are you a citizen, you are promised to the due process and equal protection under the law for all. And so that ties back into that last slide where we were talking about what is due process. Okay, what does that mean? It also very interestingly ties into diversity, because I know one of the commentators mentioned that one of the cool things about living here is the diversity. And this constitutional amendment is the reason for that, because anyone from anywhere in the world can come to the United States. If you come go through the process, the naturalization process, take your oath, become a United States citizen. And once you're a citizen, you are just as much of a citizen as, I would say George Washington's great grandchild, but he actually didn't have any children. But you get the point, right? Like you're just as American as Thomas Jefferson or anyone else because of this constitutional amendment. And the 15th Amendment, which prohibited states from denying or abridging citizens' right to vote on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. So really, really important, really transformational amendments to our Constitution. Something that I want to point out about the 15th Amendment is if you read the language, it doesn't actually grant every citizen the right to vote. And personally, I think I would have preferred that language. However, what it did do is it prohibited states from stopping people from voting because of their race or because they had been an enslaved person. And there's a difference, right? There's a difference. And because of how it's phrased, that's how you're able to find that gray area where the Jim Crow era in our country's history was really allowed to exist, right? Because what happened in the Jim Crow area, which is the period immediately following the Reconstruction era, is the states through, in the South and other places in the country, they revised their state constitutions in ways to intentionally limit and eliminate Black people's ability to participate in the electoral democratic voting process. And they did that through things like a poll tax, through a grandfather clause, or through literacy tests. And so if you notice, all three of those things, they're not saying someone can't vote because of their race, because they were Black. They're saying you can't vote because you didn't pay the poll tax, you don't have the money, or because you're not intelligent enough because you can't read, or because your grandfather didn't vote, which to me, that seems like that would violate the 15th Amendment, but they were able to get away with that for quite a while. So really transformational period in our country's history. I'd like to point out the person in the drawing on the right side of the screen. And I'm going to tell you guys his name, and I'd like you to write in the comments if anyone has ever heard of him before. So his name is Hiram Revels. And this is a picture from my book, From Black Was the Ink. There was an amazing artist who designed the cover, who illustrated the cover, and also did a number of interior art pictures. And so this is one of those pictures. Has anyone ever heard of Hiram Revels? Any answers?
No answers. Oh, nope. Just an answer saying I have not.
Okay, so no answers. Going once, going twice. Okay, so Hiram Revels.
Someone says they have, but they don't remember.
Okay, all right, that's okay, that's okay. Hiram Revels is the first Black member of Congress, right? Like, how interesting is that? And not only was he a member of Congress, he was a United States Senator who represented the state of Mississippi in the Senate beginning in 1870. He didn't stay very long. He only stayed for a year. He was actually finishing the term of both of Mississippi senators resigned their seats when at the beginning of the Civil War to take leadership positions in the Confederate States of America. And so one of Mississippi senators was Jefferson Davis. Now, how many people have heard of Jefferson Davis? I'm guessing everybody, right? That's right. I think everyone's probably heard of Jefferson Davis. So he was the president of the Confederacy. And before he was president of the Confederacy, he was a United States Senator representing the state of Mississippi. But he resigned his seat, and the other Mississippi senator also resigned his seat. So there was two vacant Senate seats from Mississippi in the U.S. Senate. Back in this time, senators were not directly elected by the residents of their state. They were actually selected by their state legislature, and they were sent to the Senate. And so Hiram Revels was selected and was sent to the United States Senate. And when he arrived, it wasn't an automatic guarantee that the Senate would accept him, would accept his appointment. It was actually very contentious because there were a number of existing senators that did not think African Americans belonged in the Senate, and they objected to it. But thankfully, in my opinion, there were a greater number of senators who thought that this is exactly what America needed, was for everyone to be represented in government. And one senator in particular, Charles Sumner from Massachusetts, who I'll talk a little bit more about later, he stood up and gave a really eloquent speech about what is America and what are our principles and our values and our beliefs, and what did we stand for? And so when Hiram Revels was sworn in as the first Black member of Congress, first Black senator, it wasn't Senator Sumner, it was another senator who called him the 15th Amendment in flesh and blood. And that's what he represented, was this opportunity for our country to really take a giant leap forward, given our past, given the years that, slavery legally existed, and really step into our beliefs that all men are created equal, and we believe in consent of the governed, and all those things on our last slide. Like, it gave us an opportunity to live our values. And so that's who Hiram Revel was. Okay, so I would like to ask you guys to put yourself in the shoes of a recently emancipated person. And to think about, if you've spent your entire life as an enslaved person, you were born in slavery, your parents were born in slavery, who you may or may not have ever known, because I think one of the most terrible aspects of slavery was family separation, and how children were sold away from their parents, and husbands from wives, and all of that. And so so many things, about the experience that an enslaved person would have, and how long people had yearned for their freedom, right? How long they wanted to be compensated for their work, and wanted to have freedom of choice and making their own decisions about their lives and their bodies and things like that. And the day comes where your greatest wish and dream is granted, and you have freedom. What do you think? What do you think would be your top priority? What would you want to do with your freedom? Does anything come to mind? Are we getting any answers?
Not yet. Oh, I think we just got a couple.
Okay.
Someone says find a job. Someone says spend time with family. Someone says have property and a place to raise their children. See family if they could.
Yeah, absolutely. I think those are all great answers.
Yeah, someone else says eat good food and be with family.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. Um, and again, when I ask questions, there are no wrong answers. It's this is just about trying to put yourself in those shoes and thinking about what that moment would mean to you. Based on what I've seen, education was a huge priority for formerly enslaved people. Um, Keep in mind that during slavery, Black people were prohibited from learning how to read and write, and not just prohibited, they could actually be maimed or killed for even attempting to learn how to read and write. Frederick Douglass talks about that experience. There's lots of other slave narratives where you read about that, where you know how important it was essentially to keep the enslaved people in the dark and uneducated, and forcing them into that position of subservience by denying them an education. And so one of the things that the emancipated people were so excited about was the opportunity to get an education. And some of the ways that was manifest is, if you notice, historically Black colleges and universities, if you guys are familiar with any HBCUs, the vast majority of them were founded in the Reconstruction era, starting around the mid 1860s and going up until about the year 1900 is when you'll see the largest explosion of founding of historically Black colleges and universities. There was a handful that were founded before the Civil War, and there have been a handful founded after 1900, but just an explosion in every state. And so you had to have a population that could support attending these schools. And so that's how strong the demand was. But not just higher education, which was incredibly important and created a pathway to the middle class for tons of African American families, and just gave them different opportunities. But not just higher ed, but also K through 12 primary education. Before the Reconstruction era, there was not no state had a public school system in the South. Some existed in northern states, but not in the South. And if you think about it, it's kind of easy to see why. Because if you were the South, was very economically stratified. You had the wealthy people, and then you tended to have the poorer white people and the enslaved Black people. And so if you were a wealthy planter white person, you could afford a tutor, a private tutor for your kids, and that was fine. And also because it was a more rural agrarian society, people tended to live, more spread out and further apart from one another. Um, and if you were a poor white person or an enslaved Black person, there just weren't that many opportunities for education. But one of the things that came about in the Reconstruction era is the creation of public school systems in the South. And someone in particular that I think deserves credit for that is a man named Robert Smalls. And he was a delegate to the South Carolina State Constitutional Convention in 1868. And he got a public education system introduced into the Constitution, into their state constitution for the first time. And that was the first state to do so, and other states followed suit. And so I didn't talk that much about my personal background, but I am a native Louisianan, a ninth generation Louisianan, and I lived there. And then I moved with my parents to Dallas when I was in elementary school, originally from Baton Rouge. But I, went to public school my whole life, and so I feel like I owe a debt of gratitude to Robert Smalls for making that opportunity possible, that there were public schools and that people could have access to an education. And I remember that was also one of the answers someone gave about what makes America so great, is that we have access to education here. Another thing that I think people were thinking about, and I think the answers also reflected this, is the importance of community, of finding your community, finding your family, building your churches. You'll also see that a lot of African American churches were created and built in this era, in this period, including a church that I'm going to end up talking about a little bit more later, is the Mother Emanuel Church in Charleston, South Carolina, where a massacre took place in 2015. But family reunification was so important. This is a clip from a newspaper where someone was trying to find their family members. And there are tons of letters like this, tons of newspaper clippings where people were trying to reunite with their family. So this says, "Do you know them? I have somewhere in Virginia, 2 brothers and 1 sister. Their names are Nick Sanders, Nusa Sanders, and Suki Tolls. My brother Uri and I were sold from Lancaster County about 45 years ago at the sale of old Mrs. Polly Cavern. My father, Abraham Sanders, belonged to Joseph C. Cavern, and after his death, his wife sold us out. I have an aunt, and anyone who knows anything about any of the above named parties will confer a great favor by writing me." And so she's in Jackson County, Mississippi, Miss Rachel Rogers. So really, really sad, but I also think very you can see the hope that this period embodied for people that were finally free from enslavement, that they could start building their lives and they could start being whole. Physical security and financial security. Someone talked about getting a job. Absolutely, right? Because these people have been working their entire life and have never earned a penny. So being able to get a job where you actually earn money for your labor was huge. And also physical security. And so one of the other things that defines this period in the Reconstruction era is the immense amount of violence and domestic terrorism that was targeted at the newly emancipated people. And so I'll touch on that a little more later. This is a picture of early members of the Ku Klux Klan that was published in a popular newspaper called Harper's Weekly. And before this picture was published, there was a lot of disbelief amongst white Americans that the Klan existed, right? And they existed, they were terrorizing Black people and neighborhoods and communities with violence that was largely focused on trying to prevent Black people from exercising their right to vote. That tended to be the tinder that lit so many of these fires where the Klan was targeting their activity. But as Black people were trying to express what was happening to them, because the Klan operated in secret and they wore hoods and they didn't identify themselves, and often the members were some of the most powerful people in the town. It included the judges and the sheriff and the large landowners and different things. There was very little accountability for the crimes that they were committing. And so as Black people were trying to raise awareness about their experiences, um, there was generally just a sense of a doubt that the Black people were making it up. But the publication of this picture was the first time that people laid eyes on who the Black people were describing, and it started to seem real, and that spurred a reaction, and encouraged the federal government to take a really strong response to try to crack down on this type of activity that was directly violating the recently passed Reconstruction amendments. Another thing about financial security is there was a bank that was created in this period called Freedmen's Bank, and it was a part of the Freedmen's Bureau that I'm sure most people have heard of the Freedmen's Bureau. But this Freedmen's Bank was intended to be a safe place for Black people to deposit their money that they started earning from their jobs. And initially it was set up as a place for Black people that served for the Union Army to deposit their pensions, because they never had a banking institution before, because again, they had never earned wages. And so this was something created by the federal government. However, it ended up having a very tragic end, where the board of the bank ended up basically stealing the money that the depositors had put into the bank and used it to do these like really speculative investments. Ended up losing all of their money. And so that was a really unfortunate thing to occur. And the other thing that Black people were really excited about was the right to vote. And so you saw really high political participation in these years, in not just the national federal elections, but also the state elections. And so if you look up any pictures of state legislatures in the 1870s, you'll see that they definitely were not all Black, and not even majority Black, but there was representation. And remember, half the population in the South was Black. And so you saw that reflected by who was running for office and who was voting. So these are some of the top priorities that I've seen in doing my research. And I also think it's really interesting if you follow concerns of African Americans. I think that you will see a lot of these same priorities today. You see that people are still trying to get an education, an affordable education, a quality education, establish their community ties, have fiscal and financial security, and are still largely, having to work really hard to ensure that they maintain their right to vote and are able to exercise their right to vote. So who were some of the people that were helping bring these priorities into existence and making them real? And so some of them that I want to highlight are, this is a picture of some of the first Black members of Congress. And so I had mentioned Hiram Revels already. He's the one depicted on the left corner. And I mentioned that he was the first Black member of Congress, but he was not the only in this period. There were actually 16 Black members of Congress who served between 1870 and 1877. And so that's an incredible number, especially considering that once the Reconstruction era ended, there weren't 16 Black Congresspeople for the next 100 years. And so that really shows you how dramatic the voter suppression was and the disenfranchisement of African Americans was during the Jim Crow period, because it was quite intentionally a complete reversal of Black people being able to engage in the political process. But it wasn't just African Americans that were bringing these priorities and making them real. And I think that's such an important part of this story that is not told enough in our schools and just our general discourse about our country, is that there were so many white Americans at this time that were also working hard to bring the American ideals and transform them into American reality. And so I had already mentioned US Senator Charles Sumner, who spoke up for Hiram Revels and why he should be admitted into the Senate and what that would represent for our country. And he was just an incredible individual. He was from the state of Massachusetts, and he was the author. Actually, okay, I'll tell you this. He was the author. I hesitated because I'm gonna ask you a question about it later, but I'll go ahead and I'll give you one freebie. He was the author of a Civil Rights Act that was passed in 1875. Passed, not just, it wasn't just a bill, it was actually became legislation that prohibited racial segregation in places open to the public. And how groundbreaking is that, right? To even think that in 1870, racial segregation was illegal. It was illegal in Washington, D.C. They had a state ordinance that wasn't a state, but a district ordinance that prohibited racial segregation in places open to the public. So that meant African Americans could go to restaurants and could go to movie theaters and stores and shops and any place that was open to the public. They could uh, partake in, they could frequent. And so quite a contrast, right, to the Jim Crow era. And so you may ask, okay, so you said this was a law, then how could the period of segregation exist? And it's because the Supreme Court struck down that law in 1883. And so that law went away and was off the books. Another really fascinating person, and these are just two of many people in this period, of many white people, of many Black people that were fighting really hard to take our American ideals and, as I said, transform them into reality. But another was Attorney General Amos Ackerman, and he is actually the first Attorney General to lead the U.S. Department of Justice. The U.S. Department of Justice was founded in the Reconstruction era, and so I mentioned that I worked there for 12 years, and I didn't know until I started doing this research that the place where I worked, and I took a lot of pride in working, was actually founded immediately after the Civil War. And one of the reasons it was founded is because the federal government's role expanded as a result of the Reconstruction amendments, and as well as various pieces of legislation that Congress passed to enforce those Reconstruction amendments. And so it gave the federal government responsibilities of ensuring all of its citizens' civil rights were protected that it did not have prior to Reconstruction. And so America, we always had an attorney general from the beginning, but that person was always just one person sort of in private practice that represented the United States as the need arose, which was not that often. But because of the transforming role of the federal government, they realized that we actually need an agency that is dedicated to doing this work. And so that's when DOJ was founded. And Amos Ackerman was the first Attorney General to actually lead the Justice Department. And what did he do in that role? Well, Congress passed a series of laws called the KKK Acts that gave the federal government the responsibility of preventing Black people from being terrorized simply for trying to vote. And so Amos Ackerman led a task force essentially to crack down on that domestic terrorism. And he went into South Carolina and ended up suspending habeas corpus. And what habeas corpus means is it's essentially, it's a part of your due process rights. And so it's saying that you can't be you can't be thrown in jail without knowing all of your charges and all of those things I talked about in your due process rights. Well, this KKK Act said when we're dealing with this type of domestic terrorism, because it's such a large spread conspiracy, we're going to give the federal government the right to temporarily suspend habeas corpus so that the bad guys can't go out and kill all of their witnesses, right? And so as African Americans are coming forward and are trying to say, hey, this Klan member just shot up my town and did all of these things, very often the people that were making the accusations were being killed before the case could ever go to trial. And so by suspending habeas corpus, the federal government was able to put all of these domestic terrorists in jail temporarily, long enough so that they could build their case and so that all of the accusers would not be murdered. So he ended up actually decimating the Klan in South Carolina, and sent a huge message that the federal government was going to take this type of activity seriously. And for decades, really, the Klan had a much lower profile until it had a revival in the 1920s, around the time the Birth of the Nation movie, actually 1915, when the Birth of the Nation movie came out, if you guys are familiar with that movie. But that spurred a revival of the Klan. So all of this leads to the book I wrote. And it's called Black Was the Ink. And I mentioned it was a young adult historical fiction about the Reconstruction era. And it is told from the perspective of a teenage African-American male from DC who is sent to stay with his family in Natchez, Mississippi for the summertime. He doesn't want to go there. When he's there, he finds out that his family's farm is being compensated, is being taken by the state. And he doesn't really care, but a ghostly ancestor comes to him and wants to make him care. And it turns out that this ghostly ancestor was someone who lived in the Reconstruction era and worked as a legislative aide to the first Black members of Congress. And so he takes the main character, Malcolm, on this journey to Reconstruction so that he can really understand and see firsthand all of the changes that were taking place in the country so that Black people could experience full equality, and also so that he can understand why that all went away. And the story was inspired by the Mother Emanuel massacre that I mentioned earlier, which occurred in Charleston, South Carolina, in the summer of 2015, when a teenage white supremacist walked into the church and sat and prayed with well, he didn't pray with them, but he sat during their Bible study for about an hour before he stood up and just unleashed a hail of gunfire and killed 9 people. And I was on maternity leave with my second son at the time, and I wanted to find a way to explain to him why these sorts of things happen, and in doing so by connecting it to our past and connecting our present with our past. So really quickly, I know we're almost out of time. I'm going to try to fly through these last couple of slides. Does anyone know what's the first federal statute to prohibit segregation in public places? And I call it first or second because I'd like to see what you guys think of, what's the first thing that comes to mind, and then I'll share with you the answer. And so I'm just going to kind of fly through, because if we get an answer, please let me know and I'll pause. But if not, I know we're running kind of short. So these are some pictures of what segregation looked like. No dogs, Negroes, or Mexicans allowed here. Colored served in the rear. Separate drinking fountains, waiting rooms for colored people only. All of that, right? And then this is a picture of Martin Luther King at the signing of, if anyone's answered, the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And so this is our present day, in effect, civil rights statute that prohibits segregation in places open to the public. This is what the Civil Rights Division, where I worked, we formally, I don't work there anymore, but they enforce this statute. However, as we just talked about on the Charles Sumner slide, almost the same statute was passed in 1875, right? However, the Supreme Court struck it down. What's the first successful boycott of a public transportation system over segregation? So a lot of people may think it's the Montgomery bus boycott, right? Which was also spearheaded by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. You see what I'm doing here, guys? There's a lot of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. connections. But actually, Robert Smalls, the person I mentioned, was responsible for getting public education introduced in the South Carolina Constitution. Um, he refused to move to a colored section of a streetcar in Pennsylvania, in Philadelphia, in what year was it? In 1864. And as a result, he was a huge war hero. He's a very fascinating figure. I really encourage all of you guys to Google him and just explore Robert Smalls, because it's way too much that I could share here. And this is actually a bronze statue of him in the National Museum of African American History and Culture, which is part of the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. But he refused to move to the segregated section. And because of his stature, because he was such a huge Civil War hero, the people in Philadelphia were just irate that he was treated that way. And they organized a boycott of the streetcars, and that led to Pennsylvania passing a law that prohibited segregation in their streetcars. When's the first time more than 5 Black people served together in Congress? So the first picture that you see here on the right, that is, those are people that were elected to Congress and were members of Congress in 1967. But the first time more than 5 Black people served together is that picture I showed you from Reconstruction era, 1873, right? And so the next time after Reconstruction ended in 1877, the next time you had that many Black people serving together was 1967. Can anyone think about anything that happened before 1967? The Voting Rights Act was passed, also encouraged by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., also supported and advocated for. And so that the Voting Rights Act was passed in 1965. And so finally, with the passage of the legislation, Black people were able to vote again and were able to elect people from their communities that represented their communities in, almost 100 years later. First lawsuit filed to desegregate a public school. People may think of Brown versus Board of Education, but there was actually a lawsuit all the way back in 1850 that Senator Charles Sumner brought. He wasn't a senator at the time. He was a private lawyer in Massachusetts, and he represented a little girl that wanted to go to her neighborhood school. They lost their court case, but they won the sympathies of the Boston and Massachusetts community. And the city of Boston passed an ordinance prohibiting segregation in schools, and the little girl was able to go to her neighborhood school. So if you notice, there was about 100 years between the first time one of these monumental events occurred and the second time, 100-year gap. So why, right? We've talked about some of the reasons. Some were, Supreme Court decisions that turned back the clock. And we also talked about the Klan activity, and domestic terrorism was a huge part of it. And so this is a map from the Equal Justice Initiative, which is a civil rights organization based in Alabama. And this is a map that they put together of all of the different massacres. And this isn't even covering like individual lynchings. There were, I think, 4,000 documented lynchings that took place in about a 7-year period during the same period in the state of Louisiana alone. This is actually larger massacres, where the numbers in red are the estimated number of people that were killed in a community. And so if you look at, for instance, Colfax, Louisiana, which is where the Colfax massacre occurred, and it's an event that I talk about in my book, Black Was the Ink. 156 people were killed at one time. And so I think it's amazing that most people have no knowledge or awareness that this was even occurring. And again, so often the impetus was about voting. It was about, political representation. Sometimes it was about economic interests, right? Like sometimes it was about a variety of things, but the political engagement and trying to suppress the political engagement of African Americans was a frequent impetus. If you guys want to delve in deeper and learn more, in addition to reading my book, these are some other books that are wonderful to explore. And one of my favorite sources that I used when writing my book is, if you see in the middle here, it says Congressional Record. It was the Library of Congress, which has digitalized the congressional records for like time forever. And you can actually go, if you know the congressional session that you're looking for, the year, the date, you can read the debate. So I was able to actually like read the debates and see what the different people were arguing and what they said all the way back in 1870. And it was truly, it was fascinating. And where I could, I tried to incorporate the actual language and speeches into the book, because I wanted people to really understand what was happening. And you'll also see so many parallels, as I've kind of alluded to, from this era to issues that we're still grappling with in the present. And along those same lines, if you look back at what's been said before, what different orators have said, the theme that I'm expressing here is not really novel or new. Frederick Douglass, if you guys have ever read his speech, "What to the American Slave is your 4th of July?" I answer, a day that reveals to him more than all other days in the year the gross injustice and cruelty to which he is the constant victim. To him, your celebration is a sham, right? And so he was just pointing out that gulf between the rhetoric of who we are and the reality for the African American experience. This is a speech that he gave prior to the Civil War and the Reconstruction era. But you've also have Langston Hughes, that's on the right side, where this is a poem that he wrote, "Oh, let America be America again, the land that never has been yet and yet must be, the land where every man is free." And so he was a Harlem Renaissance poet, so he wrote this, I don't know if it was the 1920s or 1930s. And then again, we've got Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in the picture from his "I Have a Dream" speech. And one of the things he said at that speech was, "I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." And so, I think in essence, we all have to do our part to make these dreams a reality. And it's not something that will happen on its own. It takes every single American believing in America, believing in our promise, believing in our dream, and doing the work to make it real. So that's the end of my presentation. That's my contact information, my website, my IG, my Twitter. And so, feel free to reach out or, follow, and would love to keep in touch.
We did have one question. I don't know if you can take a moment just to.
Yes, of course.
Do you believe that Black people should exercise their right to vote due to the blood that was shed for this right?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think that's the best way to bring about change and to bring in the reality that you want to see is by participating in the voting process. And it's a right that every citizen has, as long as you haven't been stripped of that right, because people in various states that have been convicted of crimes, of felonies, have lost their right to vote and are not able to vote. But absolutely, I think if you have the right to vote, you should use your voice, you should exercise it. It is it's pretty much like the only nonviolent means to bring about change. And I think that's something that we should all embrace. And it's one of the beautiful things about living in a society that embraces democratic principles.
Thank you so much, Michelle, for that, and answering all those questions, or that one question for us. Our next MLK speaker will be on March 28th, like Andrea said in the chat. But if everybody could help me in thanking Michelle tonight. We really appreciate you coming and sharing your wisdom and your knowledge with us. It's been really an honor to have you. So thanks for being here. And thanks to everybody who came as well. We couldn't have had this without you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Thanks for coming. Thanks for everybody for participating. I really appreciate that, and hope everyone took away some, some food for thought. So thank you.
Thanks. Someone also says, really wonderful presentation. Thank you. But the chat is still closed. So that was in the Q&A.
Oh, okay. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Have a good night, everyone. Thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye.